Everyone, my name is Catherine Emmerich, and I'm a student in Professor Schroeder's Archival Access and Description course for the fall of 2020. I noticed that I like to take my research paper in a little bit of a different direction than a lot of other students in this course. I really wanted to look at the effects of the coronavirus pandemic on archival access because we're all graduating soon, and I'd really like to know where we're headed and what the future of our field looks like. So the title of my paper was Unprecedented, an evaluation of the future of archives during the coronavirus pandemic. And to start off, I like to look at a couple of guiding ideas just for the purposes of this presentation. I had read a couple of recent publications in the American Archivist just on funding and sanitization efforts and stuff like that. And that had got me thinking, what is this going to look like for us in the future? And I had noticed also personal access issues in terms of catalogs. I had been digging through the Bentley and a couple of other catalogs for a little bit of fun. And I noticed that a lot of the stuff that I really wanted to view and I was very interested in just wasn't cataloged enough for me to be able to understand completely what I was looking at from home. So I would really like to know how we're going to fix that. The practicum was also a big factor in me deciding to discuss this, as a lot of us, me, for example, are starting our practicum next semester and we are unable to actually physically work in the archives. So I want to know what our work is going to look like and how we're going to be able to have that experience and hands-on necessity without actually being in the building. The work from home order was a huge deal for a lot of people, and I know that it affected a lot of archivists because when you're an archivist, you work hands-on with materials a lot of the time. So working from home, you can't do that. So what are we doing? What does their day-to-day work look like? And how is that going to affect us? So I started off with looking at the current conditions from the beginning of the pandemic until now. And I noticed that at the beginning, it started off with a lot of panic, very obviously in a lot of fields, but there was a panic to leave the buildings for your own personal safety, which is key. There was also a very hard time deciding on who was essential. In a bunch of statements by the ALA, it was stated that day-to-day workers and office working was not essential, also stated by many mandates for all different states, including Michigan. And the essential workers were deemed to be janitorial staff and security staff to keep the materials safe from environmental issues and safe from people stealing them. So I also looked into the sanitizing efforts, particularly dealing with historical materials that was provided on the ALA website, which was a link to the NCPTT guidelines in a little video that they made about how to sanitize against coronavirus. So they noticed that the virus took 4 to 12 days, depending on the material, to not be infectious anymore. So for the materials that were in circulation during the beginning of the pandemic, before we shut down, that could have the virus, could be contaminated by the virus, they could be bleached, but obviously that's not a great idea in terms of historical materials. So what they ultimately decided on was the fact that it requires isolation periods, just like us quarantining. So that affected a day-to-day life in the fact that if your materials and you were using them, or if your materials were being used at the beginning of the pandemic, they required a 14-day isolation, just like we do. I noticed a lot of places were laying people off, and in the UK, one of my main articles that I looked at was done by an author, McCann, and McCann talked about the furloughs in the UK and what they're doing with their furloughed employees, which actually completely took a turn that I was not expecting. They are continuing education efforts with their furloughed employees. So they have online seminars, they have things that they need to do, despite the fact that they are not working particularly with their materials. And the furloughed employees were only the ones who were not able to were required to physically work with their materials and could not do their work online. So there was a lot of safety keeping measures in terms of making sure their employees are able to do what they need to do, and if they can't, making sure they have something else. It did also require a lot of shift in responsibilities because you're not working with your physical materials. Students are requiring more assistance. As stated in one of my other articles that I used, a study was done and there was a very big digital literacy skills issue with patrons because a lot of people that use archives aren't necessarily looking digitally, but now they have to. So librarians and archivists had to shift to teaching digital literacy and how to use those materials. So it led to a lot of shift in responsibility in the workplace. There was a lot of different views going on. So there's a patron-centered view versus the employee-centric view. Who are we primarily working on? The ALA obviously states that patrons are the key because they are what keep archivists and libraries running. And the employee-centric view is keeping yourself safe. Now that shifted at the beginning of the pandemic, and the ALA was more stressing, keep your employees safe, because obviously we want to keep ourselves safe from getting sick. So it all came down to what is our priority. And currently the priority, as the pandemic shifts and changes, because it's a continuously changing thing, resulted in how we can keep ourselves safe, but also be patron-centric. So I decided to look at the benefits of this pandemic because I really wanted to take something positive out of this and not look at the future of archives as being, oh my gosh, we can't do any of our work. And what is that going to look like? So how are we remaining relevant? There's a lot of diversity in responsibilities now because they're required to teach digital literacy. When they can't work physically with their collections, they're requiring librarians and archivists to go back and look at currently cataloged materials and revise that metadata and revisit all of the things that maybe they were cataloged quickly when they were acquisitions and then just never looked at again. So it's a lot of physical changing of the catalog, which is amazing to see, which creates a stronger staff in the workplace, because in the future, if a area studies librarian is out and they're looking at the crosses between the catalogs or the collections in the catalog, they're able to recommend different catalogs, even though that may not be their area of study, because they're just so required to be diverse in their knowledge of the catalogs of the catalogs and collections as a whole. So obviously, yes, we have our revitalized catalogs, our collections, and they're also revitalizing the sites as well, just the library sites in general. So it's easier for patron access, easier for them to search using their metadata keys, or the terms, key terms, and the metadata is more revised. So it's pulling up more relevant information for these patrons in general. There's cross-training, obviously, in terms of like the separation. So like research librarians and research archivists are working, other people who wouldn't necessarily work with the patrons are now working more with the patrons, because that's the goal, is to get your stuff to be used and to be able to be relevant. So they're able to come back when we do decide to reopen and have this knowledge of the whole, the organization as a whole, which means that on a day-to-day basis, you're going to have a lot more people be able to do a lot more responsibilities. And there, obviously, as I stated with the furloughing, there's a lot of further learning that is occurring. So our staff and staff in archives as a whole are learning and evolving to be a stronger field in general, and to be able to be more relevant and connect with the community through social media, which was a really big one as well. There's a lot more community involvement in this stuff, and we are bringing ourselves more relevant and more up to date because we were forced into a situation where we have to. So there's a lot of unique developments too that I found very interesting, because there's a whole new creation of new archives. And it is a broad term, archive. So these are web archives, obviously, because we can't have physical buildings at the moment. But preservation of human history is a goal of archivists and archives in general. We got to preserve our history. We got to preserve the stories of the people. So obviously there's a large difference between the 1918 pandemic, influenza pandemic, and the coronavirus pandemic that we are currently experiencing, in the fact that technology is completely different. As I'm sitting in front of you doing a presentation on a computer versus standing in front of a lecture hall and presenting on this. We are able to connect with many, many different people across dimensions and have that emotional connection over an internet, which is really reliable, but it also creates more things that need to be archived, more stories, more emotions, more art, more everything. So the one thing that I noticed in my research when I was looking was actually there's a lot of non-archivists creating digital repositories for what I like to call the COVID diaries. So a big one that I was looking at is actually called the coronavirus pandemic stories. And they are, categorizing stories for, I apologize. The name, that's the website. The name is called the Coronavirus Lost and Found, a Pandemic Archive. So it was created by a media and communications associate professor, and her goal was to share stories and share hope and emotions. But this is creating a big portion of human history because it's showing the day-to-day experiences of everyone. And the difference in this metadata that she created, because she's thinking not as an archivist, but as a communications and media professor, is a little bit different than what we would normally see. So for example, hers are categorized as lost or found. So lost is the type of story where you would see you're losing somebody, you lost something during the pandemic. And the found is what I like to call a faith in humanity restored story. So some good experience that came out of this. And so in formal archives, we don't really categorize just based on two categories like that. And there are keywords, but a lot of keywords are just lost and found in this repository. So it is very emotionally driven. And normally with our metadata, we see it's very objectively driven. So how are we going to adapt these new stories and these new repositories into our own archives at some point? Because researchers are in 20 to 60 years are going to write papers on this and how this happened and what actually occurred. And they're going to want these stories. So us as a field, archivists as a field and as a whole, need to figure out how we're going to adapt this to be our future, these repositories that were made by non-archivists. So are we going to adapt them into our current standard metadata, or are we going to adapt our metadata into including these emotional responses and these stories and create an entirely new type of pandemic archive? So in conclusion, our future is very unknown. The pandemic is still occurring and changing on a daily basis. Digital learning might be the future. I know we are going to be digital next semester as well, and there's no saying for the fall of 2021 because we have no idea how this is going to play out and what that vaccine is going to look like. However, education is going to be the key. So the continued education of not only students and us helping our students and our patrons, but us learning how to adapt ourselves and our metadata to be able to reflect what these students and these patrons need. There's strength in adaptation because the more jobs we're able to do as one person and the more we can complete makes us more of a complete whole, and knowing the entire archive and our collections and how they connect makes us better archivists. There could be a new patron base because a lot of students are coming out of this not knowing where else to research. For example, the freshmen that are starting college this year, they're going to use their online resources to the best of their abilities, including the archives. And when we get back to being, if we ever get back to being what we were beforehand, they're still going to rely on that online base because that's what they know and that's how they learned to research. So we're going to have a whole new patron base, and that is very exciting. And how do we adapt our metadata terms and our online bases to be more simplistic and easier for them to use? With the adaptation of new archives, how do we compile those stories and use them in our archives for the future? And I'm not talking like 10 years from now. I'm saying 60 to 100. How are we going to keep this? Because this is a huge portion of human history. And it is very uncertain. However, we do have the security that we are going to be relevant and we are going to be needed, because that's the most positive thing we can think of right now. It may be unpredictable and it may be an unprecedented situation, but the story always needs to be told and the story always needs to be preserved. So we will be there and we will have a lot to say, but how are we going to adapt is the key. New metadata is important. Education is key, and digital learning and continuing our own personal learning is what's going to be key on top of our keeping our employees safe. So thank you all for listening to my presentation. If you would like to read my paper, feel free to contact me. Thank you so much.